Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I make sense of what's happening in the news, technology, business, and beyond through the lens of economics. Let's jump right in. Shall we get started on the mailbag?
Let's do it.
First question from Simon in San Francisco. Congrats on celebrating 4 years of No Opinion. What are the biggest things you've changed your mind about in the last couple of years?
Well, let's see. I have changed my mind about the importance of policing. I was kind of libertarian beforehand, like in the 2010s. I thought, America has just like, we over police and, police are out of control, blah, blah. I didn't, I wasn't prepared to go out and, march in the streets and seal off a bridge to like defund the police. I didn't want to do that. And defunding the police was always dumb, but I thought, huge reforms are needed. I still think there are reforms we could do to make things better, but I think that sort of the crucial importance of public order to our cities has really impressed itself upon me. So I'm the socialist people call YIMBYs carceral urbanists because they think public order is necessary in order to have dense, walkable cities. But it really is. And so, I now think that, I still think that we give out way too many long prison sentences. I think that long prison sentences turn normal people into career criminals because it basically, destroys all of your life and turns your, except for crime, right? It destroys your economic prospects, and it basically removes you from all friends and human interaction except for career criminals. And also, I don't think it exerts a deterrent effect at all. But in fact, the research backs me up on this pretty strongly. If you look at how basically the idea is that long prison sentences will scare and deter criminals. And Gary Becker, a famous economist, really, was very adamant about thinking this. All of our evidence shows that this doesn't work. To a person who's considering, robbing some store, right? The prospect of a 30-year prison sentence for that versus the prospect of a 1-year prison sentence for that doesn't make a difference in their mind. Like, they're not thinking through of what that will be like. They haven't even been alive for that long. It's just, you don't understand the difference between like a 1-year or let's say like a 2-year and a 30-year prison sentence when you're like 20. Basically, what needs to happen is long prison sentences should only be for people who are incorrigible, the super predators, let's say, who need to be just removed from society completely because there's no real help for them. They're violent, can't control themselves, they need to be removed. But then that's a relatively small fraction of people. And I think most criminals, if you just give them a very swift, certain slap on the wrist and a short prison sentence, make them do a couple weeks in jail or something, I don't know, but catch them with very high probability, then that will deter them. And so I think that more policing and less prisons are what we need. And in fact, not less prisons, but less long prison sentences, let's say. And that is, if you look at it, that is what Europe does, for example. Europe has generally more police than we do, and their police are much more professionalized. And I mean, you go to Paris and there's guys standing around with machine guns on the street. And yet it's really nice. You sip in a nice cafe, you're not scared because the police are very professional. Those are the national gendarmerie or whatever, however you pronounce that. And so, it's the national police, and we don't really have that, but they're incredibly professional. Those people have college degrees and with the machine guns. And so, yeah, basically, that's what we need to do. The long prison sentences aren't working. In fact, they're probably anti-work. Well, yeah, they're not really working. We should only have those for like, X number of strikes and you're out kind of criminals. The incorrigible people. And then, I don't know if 3 is the right number of strikes, but some number of strikes and you're out, you're removed from society, goodbye. And then, but then for most people, I think just knowing that it's very likely that you'll be caught, I think is the way to deter these things. And that means more cops. Cops do other stuff, they stand around on street corners and make it seem safer. They, et cetera. And so I think that they sort of proactively disrupt criminal gangs and things. So I think that basically I am now, obviously I think that we need to professionalize the police and train them to make sure they don't act like a gang and just beat the shit out of people and shoot people on a hair trigger. But I think that at the same time, we need like more cops and more policing in America.
Do you think we should have more sort of like, what is the technological solution for this that we could feel good about? Like, is there sort of, more surveillance, so that if people committed a crime, they would sort of guaranteed that it would be them who'd be discovered? Or is there, I feel crazy suggesting drones or something, but is there like, more technology that should be applied to this solution? Or is it, no, we already know it works? And
Well, the thing is that drones make a droning sound, and so you don't want to have a whole bunch of them flying over your city constantly. I mean, I guess you could have them up high, but that's going to be very energy intensive. You could have like balloons and things. I don't know. Just put cameras on things. We have buildings, we have lampposts. Just put cameras on them. Yeah, surveillance cameras are heavily used in Europe and heavily used in Asia. And crime, was never very high there, but it has gone down a lot due to the cameras. And so a public place is public. I don't want Big Brother. But being able to have that footage to make sure that if a crime gets committed, the person will be caught. And then, if we give out like definite short jail sentences, then, like if I do this, like I will be caught, it's just going to happen. It will deter a heck of a lot of crime, I think. And it'll make walkable spaces safe, and it will allow us to have better cities.
I want to segue to, so that's something you've changed your mind about. It relates to a question Miles asked, which is, should public safety be a human right?
I mean, what does a human right mean? Like
something that we really focus on.
Well, of course, public safety should be a big focus of our government. Usually we think of a right as something that you can't stop an individual, that the government is not allowed to stop an individual from doing. Some people extend this to be something the government should provide to an individual. But as for, the government sort of providing public safety, that's sort of the government providing it to all of society. So I'd say it's not as much of an individual right. So it's not, I don't think of it in terms of the framing of individual rights, but I think in terms of one of the basic responsibilities of government.
This is from Logan Stevens. How big of a deal is a country's age demographics? I've seen a lot of people online saying that China is on its way to collapse because the country is getting old and cannot replace people at the rate they need to or feed themselves. Is this true? How will it affect the Chinese economy in the future?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, China's demographic woes are heavily overstated because there is an echo of the baby boom generation coming through, the Gen Alphas, who are the grandkids of the baby boomers. And the baby boomers were a huge generation in China. You think America had this big baby boom. We had this fertility rate of like 3 for a little while, right? China had a fertility rate of like 6.5. I don't know. It was like just insane baby boom for a while. And so then that big bulge has echoes, right? Their kids are a big generation mechanically, even if their fertility rates aren't high. And their kids are a big generation mechanically, even if their fertility rates aren't high. So the Gen Alphas who are now, 10 to 15, or let's say 5 to 15, these people are coming down the pike. They're about to enter the labor force. 15 is like just below the level of which you're considered in the labor force, right? 16 is when you are. So China's working age population is set to increase. That's a weird thing to say because their fertility rate's so incredibly low. But because of this echo, their working age population is set to increase until 2027. And 2027 is the peak. And then after that, it will start to decline. But the decline, this big generation will have to work its way through the system. And China's demographics won't get to Japan level until mid-century. So China's got 15 years of being like a relatively youthful, middle-aged, let's say, country. I don't know. Being somewhere in the developed range. And then around 2050, things start to get severe. Things start to get there then to where Japan is now. And so I think that they've got a while. 25 years is a long time. And I think that China, obviously, its leaders hope that it will become like global hegemon or whatever in 25 years. Like if they can in 25 years, that's a long time, right? And they're already sort of at their, hitting their peak right now. And if they can't become global hegemon in 25 more years of peak, they never will. And so I think that the next 25 years are crucial for them, and their demographics are not going to be severe and not going to prevent that from happening. After 2050, things get pretty severe. And, I at that point, I'd be pretty concerned. And I don't think they're going to be able to do anything to prevent that, because I think it'll take a while, to figure out how to get people to have more kids. We don't know. Nobody knows. Like Elon tweeting about it isn't going to raise the fertility rate at all, right? It's not going to do anything. So you can pay people to have kids, and then you get a whole bunch of people yelling like, "Look at these good for nothing welfare slobs having all these kids on the government coin," right? So like, and the people you pay to have more kids are the poor. So you're going to get more poor kids, and people are going to be like, "No, it's these people swamping us," like. This is a very controversial policy, how to get like middle class people to have more kids. That's not clear. No one has any ideas about that. And so like people are like, well, let's just change culture. Okay, fine. But you've been, tweeting. Does that work? You're just going to tweet and change culture. You're going to make some TikToks and then everyone's going to have a bunch of kids. No, that's not, there probably is some way. Like we had the baby boom generation. We were having relatively low fertility before that. And then we had this sudden baby boom where fertility increased for a while. Something happened. Maybe we could do that again. We need to study it. There needs to be a lot of money and effort put towards this research. And maybe if Elon were not so busy funding like, Republican super PACs, he could put his money toward, hardcore large N RCT research on changing demographics.
We had a baby boom, and was it after World War II, right? When the men came back from war.
And I can't tell you why that happened. We can wave our hands and say, oh, it's because we opened up the suburbs, all this space. Everybody had a great job. Economic growth was fast, blah, blah, blah. Maybe people were just de-stressing from the war by having a bunch of kids. Actually, there's some sign that the baby boom began during World War II, but there were just not enough men around. But women started wanting to have more kids during World War II. And so it's not clear, yeah.
Well, Israel has a lot of kids. Maybe whenever there's sort of existential, although I'm sure we could find countries that are in existential, have existential threats and yet don't, aren't at replacement rate.
Yeah, I don't know.
Which countries do you think are the most screwed because of the demographic, like are most likely to collapse due to sort of demographic?
Well, I don't know how much demographics makes you collapse. It just makes you work really hard. Like, young people have to work to support all the olds. And then it also makes countries stagnate because, old people are in charge of all the companies and they don't have a lot of new ideas. And, if you look at Japanese companies, look at Honda and Nissan trying to merge or whatever, like they've been completely unable to meet the challenge of electric cars. And that's why Chinese companies are eating their lunch. And so that's why, because they're all run by old guys because they have seniority promotion. You can fight against that by not having seniority promotion, by promoting young people over old people. But then, people just sticking around, they're going to learn how organizations work and they're going to climb the ladder and blah, blah, blah. And old people will be good at, they're like a million little Xi Jinpings, right? Xi Jinping climbed his way through this system and then dominated the system, but he doesn't have a lot of great ideas. Now he's on top. He's great at becoming on top, but what can he do with that? Not a lot. And so I think that's how companies work. They're little dictatorships. And, they become these sort of like ossified dictatorships without the dynamic original founder at the helm, right? Like Elon's companies are going to revert once he stops paying attention to them. Like it'll take them 10 years maybe, but then SpaceX, Tesla, these will be very boring, non-standout companies. And there's econometric evidence to support that. And so anyway, I guess the point is that basically you toil and your labor goes less and less far when everybody's old. And eventually what happens is that you can't support old people. So you, instead of collapsing, what happens is you just cut benefits for the old people, go back to living in poverty. We can't sustain like social security systems. But that's the way things used to work in America. Like old people used to live in poverty. Being old meant you were poor and that sucked and you would die unless you managed to have kids who would support you, or you managed to save up enough money that you could support yourself in your old age and be a rich old person. But that wasn't common. Well, I guess having kids to support you was common, but being a rich old person was not common. So anyway, I guess that the point being, it may be that what's unsustainable is simply old people not being poor. And that's a grim thing to say, but like, you don't have any other ideas. Like if you just don't have the young people to be able to support the old people's consumption and take care of them directly, of course, then what do? There's nothing. Game over. You automate, right? You try to use capital to replace labor, And maybe with AI, that'll get really good. Maybe we'll get very good elder care bots, and that will be fine. AI will solve it. It will replace all the human care workers. But if that doesn't happen, we're in trouble. If AI doesn't provide the the economic growth to be able to support the consumption, right, of the old people, if it doesn't supercharge agriculture so we can feed the old people, if it doesn't supercharge construction so we can house the old people, but all this stuff, right, like then the old people will still be poor, even if they have AI care workers, right? It's not just about the direct provision of care. It's about the consumption. And so, old people are going to work. I don't know, like maybe there's all kinds of crazy things that I could speculate on. We could do the sci-fi episode. Actually, we should get some sci-fi authors on the podcast and talk to them and like speculate wildly about sci-fi. But yeah, it's just going to be hard. I wouldn't say that countries are going to collapse. I would say that countries will stagnate and diminish.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. There are over 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the United States and millions more around the world. How do you know which ones can make the biggest impact with your donation? GiveWell was founded to help donors with that exact question. They pore over independent studies and charity data to help donors direct their funds to evidence-backed organizations that are saving and improving lives. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. If you've never used GiveWell to donate, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick podcast and enter Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Erik Torenberg at checkout. Make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from Econ 102 to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.
What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 40,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days, not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to your immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/102. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/102. That's netsuite.com/102.
This relates to a question from Brian. When comparing across countries, how should we think about the differences between GDP and GDP per capita? And that also relates to another post you wrote comparing Japan and America.
Right. Well, total GDP is useful for national power, whether that's purchasing power, how much weight can you throw out on the global market, how you could do things like sanctions, you could, get influence by opening your markets to people. And those are, those are ways where total GDP matters, right? Like China has a ton of weight, even though its per capita GDP isn't very high. It's a middle income country on the books, but then it's in purchasing power, international purchasing power, it's second to the United States, but it can throw a lot of weight around. So that's where total matters for power. And of course for military power, because you can build stuff. It's not a perfect translation, but that's, your total, let's say, manufacturing output is closely related to your total military power. But per capita GDP is living standard. That's how well off are your people. So, why do you care? Why do you care how well off your people are? Well, maybe you're a good leader who cares about the people, or maybe you want to get elected, or maybe you're afraid of being overthrown. And so there's lots of reasons to care about the welfare of the people, even if you're a jerky leader who spent your whole life trying to, get into the halls of power, you still might care about the people for many, many reasons. And so per capita GDP matters for living standards, and total GDP matters for national power.
This relates to another question by Stevens, which is, Can you give an overview of purchase power parity in common English? And how could the US increase its PPP, and how does it compare to other countries like China?
So usually when we measure GDP at market exchange rates, if the yuan appreciates by double against the dollar, then China's market exchange rate GDP doubles. Did it really? Did China really produce more stuff? I don't know. In terms of international purchasing power, market exchange rate GDP is very important. How much you can buy in the international market is incredibly important. But if you're talking about living standards per capita, if you're talking about how well off are people, then there's a lot more that matters, right? Like market exchange rate GDP, which we sometimes call nominal, even though that has other meanings as well. Market exchange rate GDP matters for imports, being able to buy imports. But that's not all you want to buy. You also want to buy lots of stuff domestically. In fact, most of the stuff you buy is domestic. You buy rent, you buy healthcare, you buy, locally, like food grown within your own country, you buy transportation, you buy insurance, you buy whatever. Those are all domestic things, and the domestic price matters. So if you really want to compare living standards in terms of how much actual stuff can people in various countries afford, you need to look at those local prices, because if you have two countries where people make the same number of dollars, but in one of those countries, healthcare and housing and transportation are twice as expensive, the people in the country where it's more expensive are actually poorer, right? Eric, does this make sense to you at least? Okay. So we got to measure these local prices, and that's all PPP is. Purchasing power parity just means we measure local prices and we compare them to the United States local prices. That's it.
Another question he has is, when a country is having a currency crisis, can you explain in basic English what's happening?
So in a currency crisis, so lots of countries import their food and fuel and other basic necessities, but it's usually food and fuel. And even countries that grow enough food to feed themselves will import food. And even countries that produce enough fuel to fuel themselves will import fuel, because they don't produce all the types of food and fuel that they need, right? So they might produce crude oil, but not, natural gas. They might produce heavy oil, but not light oil, whatever, refined gasoline. So there's all these, so countries import food and fuel and other stuff, but mostly food and fuel. When your currency goes down in value, when your currency gets weaker, you can't afford as many imports of food and fuel. So if you're heavily dependent on that, which many countries are, your people will suddenly get poorer and it'll suck. And so that's a currency crisis. It's basically your currency goes way down in value.
And what are the factors that determine whether it goes down or up?
Well, there could be a number of factors. One factor is if you've been stupid and you declared an exchange rate peg. You say, my currency, the bolivar, will be worth $100 per bolivar because the bolivar is so strong, rah. And then yet you can't support that. Everybody wants to say, oh, bolivar should only be worth 1 cent instead of $100. Then everybody will, then there'll be market pressure on the currency to depreciate.
And why would Bolivia do such a thing, or why would any country sort of do an exchange rate peg?
To afford more imports. So if you're a populist leader and you've promised, when I, revolutionary leader Noah, am in charge of this country, then everyone will have free food and free fuel, which we're all going to just import from America with our super, super, super strong currency. We're going to just import tons of food and fuel. You're going to have parties, banquets every day, and drive your car wherever you want for free because we give you these fuel subsidies. Okay, cool. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, I've declared that the bolivar is worth $100. So obviously we can easily just print some bolivars and import all this food from America. Give us the stuff, America. Give us the free stuff. And so then America gives you the free stuff, the food and the fuel, and you've just paid for it with these bolivars that you've declared are each worth $100. Now you get free stuff for your people, and everybody's happy, and you are the great, great leader. And then leftists in America write glowing articles about how you solved poverty and all we need is socialism and blah, 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 blah. And then what happens? How are you going to keep the bolivar equal to like $100 or whatever? How are you going to do that? Well, you have to intervene in currency markets. So as soon as someone tries to trade bolivars for less than $100, you've got to go sell dollars and buy bolivar on that swap market so that you push the price of the bolivar back up to $100 and you push down the price of the dollar against the bolivar. By selling dollars, buying bolivar. So you intervene, right? You got to sell dollars, buy bolivar on the swap market. Your central bank does this. And so that's how you maintain a peg. You defend the peg. That's called defending a peg, right? But remember that part where I just said you had to sell dollars? You got to have dollars if you want to sell dollars, right? You can't just borrow them. I mean, yeah, you could if you're like a fancy currency trader who has like a, can short sell, whatever. But like, you can't do this if you're a central bank. You got to have the dollars to sell them. And you have a limited stockpile of dollars. If you're the government of, Venezuela or whatever, like resource dependent country we're imagining. If you're this government, you don't have infinite dollars just sitting around. You don't print dollars. You don't make dollars. The US makes dollars. You don't. You have to store them up to defend this peg. Once you run out, then all of a sudden your currency crashes, and in a day, suddenly no one can afford their daily, banquets and driving everywhere they want. And so then people get really mad and they charge Noah's presidential palace, and they're like, and Noah has to like flee to Russia because, his dictatorship has collapsed. So this is what happens. And so, of course, I was democratically elected with 87% of the vote. They loved me. Why are they marching in the streets? Why are they burning down my 12 presidential palaces? Anyway, so that's what happens because you defend this peg, and then one day it fails, right? And so then you can have these sneaky rich currency traders who wait and pounce by waiting until they, of course, the government will keep its amount of reserves a secret. But then if you're a sneaky currency trader like George Soros, you can figure it out, right? And then you're like, wait, if I sell this amount of so he did this to England, actually, which is kind of funny. He was like, okay, if I sell this many pounds today, that will, there'll be a pound collapse. And he did. And there was. And like Britain's like, oh, fuck, oh no. And then like, Soros got us. He got us. He made a bunch of money on that. Anyway, but the point is that the reason currencies collapse primarily because of the failure of a peg. But there can be other reasons too. There can just be a sort of a stampede, like herd behavior. That's not the only reason they collapse. There can be other reasons. Any reason you think for like a big price movement in asset markets, a big stock collapse, any reason that could happen, a currency collapse could happen.
Is that what was happening to Japan earlier with the yen, or was that something else?
Yes, that's it. People just decided that, Japan. So
yeah, what was happening there again?
Yeah, with Japan, they didn't have a peg. They had a floating exchange rate, but their central bank does sometimes intervene. And so what happened is that inflation was structurally low in Japan because of aging and low productivity. And so inflation did surge in Japan, but like to 2%, right? Where it surged to 8% everywhere else. So Japan didn't need to raise interest rates nearly as high to stop the inflation. So the Japanese central bank didn't, it kept interest rates pretty low. Whereas in America and Europe, they raised interest rates really high because they had a lot more structural inflation. And so they had to raise interest rates a lot higher to beat that inflation. Like Powell raised interest rates here, and Europeans raised interest rates. We raised interest rates. Now, bond traders want higher interest rates, right? If you're buying bonds, you would like higher interest rates. So if you're like, I could buy these Japanese government bonds that pay me like 1%, or in real terms like 0, or I could buy these American bonds that pay in real terms 2%. Well, that's free money. Let's get our money out of Japanese bonds. Let's sell all these Japanese bonds and let's buy the American bonds. When you do that, when you move your money from Japanese assets to American assets, you depreciate your currency, because remember, currencies are useful for two things. They're useful for buying bonds and they're useful for buying exports. So if you sell the Japanese bonds and you buy all the American bonds, then the Japanese currency will depreciate because people are moving money. We say they're moving money out of yen, but they're really moving money out of Japanese bonds denominated in yen, for which they have to sell those bonds, which floods the market with yen, which depreciates the value of the yen. And so they do that and they move their money out, and then the Japanese currency goes down, and then it doesn't go down as much as it should because people are like, well, the Bank of Japan doesn't want it to go down too much because of these imports of food and fuel. It's like a soft peg, right? You think the Japanese government's going to intervene to stop this. But when you decide, okay, I guess they're done intervening, then the currency decline resumes. So that's what happened.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Our sponsor for today's episode is Carta, the end-to-end accounting platform that's purpose-built to power the strategic impact of the fund CFO. For the first time ever, private fund operators can now leverage their very own bespoke software that's designed from the ground up to bring their whole portfolio together, enabling formations, transactions, and distributions to flow seamlessly and accurately. The end result? a remarkably fast and precise platform that empowers better strategic decision-making and delivers transformational insights on demand, timely K1s, holistic fund performance data, and so much more. Come see the new standard in private fund management at carta.com/investors. That's carta.com/investors. Do you have any concerns about the dollar in light of this aspect? Is there any risk of a currency trouble for the dollar?
That would have to be pretty extreme because what would have to happen is a lot of inflation in America. Basically, it would have to suck to keep your money in dollars. If that happened, people could just abandon the dollar and move elsewhere. People aren't going to abandon the dollar for like Bitcoin. That's not going to happen. They'd have to abandon the dollar for euros or yuan. So the way this would happen, the way the dollar crisis would happen in practice, so euro, is screwed, whatever. Europeans, they got no game. All they do is regulate. We know this. So, but China has game, right? China is us 100 years ago. And they could do to us what we did to Britain, which even the population ratios are similar.
Yeah. Is it in our interest to have a sort of persistent trade deficit as opposed to sort of an equal, amount of imports or export? What's ideal for us?
It is not in our interest. First of all, a trade deficit is a loan that has to be paid back or partially defaulted on. You can default on your trade deficit loan with inflation, just like you default on any debt partially with inflation. Or you can pay it back by running trade surpluses at some point in the future. Either way, trade surplus just means I'm paying for physical goods with IOUs. So that, in that sense, that really is like our country acting like a household with respect to the other countries. It's like we're borrowing. We're taking stuff and we're writing IOUs for that stuff.
And you don't want to act like a household?
Well, no, I mean, we have to in the international sense. Our government isn't a household when dealing with its own people, but it's more like a household when dealing with China and Japan and Europe and Saudi Arabia and all these countries, right? It's like we're one actor among many. We don't have control over what they do. And so, all this stuff about us being like this hegemony, this empire and blah, blah, is just people blowing smoke. Like we can't actually control what they do. So,
and why aren't we a household domestically? Because we do control what people do? Or that's just the wrong analogy?
So domestically, we're not a household because like when we borrow money, we're borrowing money from ourselves. So it's more like, if you want to extend the household analogy, it's like domestically, it's like we have a house fund and the house fund is borrowing from dad. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
The house fund, like dad might do this to teach kids about finance, but it's not, if the Torenberg household owes money to like Erik's dad.
Right.
Like, what does that mean? So that's why internal borrowing is not like a household, but external is, because it's like America is just like a guy. It's like Uncle Sam, borrowing from like, Uncle She.
Yeah. And so how do we solve for the trade deficit problem that we've had then? What are the best ways?
We have to weaken the dollar.
Interesting.
On international markets. And Trump knows this. But the problem is that everyone likes the strong dollar. So now that Trump.
And by everyone, you mean like China or just everyone here too?
Oh, no, here, I mean. The thing is that Wall Street loves strong dollar because strong dollar means that they can borrow money very cheaply from overseas, which they then use to finance the finance industry. I am optimistic. We're seeing this epochal power shift in DC with the second Trump administration, where Wall Street people are being replaced by tech people, Silicon Valley. The power center of the American elite has just flipped from the East Coast to the West Coast. You're seeing people like, Sriram Krishnan, friend of mine, great guy. He got appointed, and obviously Elon and Vivek and who else? I guess David Sachs and crypto stuff, but I don't know what that's going to do. But you're starting to see Silicon Valley people getting appointed all these things that used to be just investment bankers get appointed to these things. And so and this is really the triumph of Andreessenism, because Andreessen was always like, the West Coast has to take over from the East Coast. The East Coast is sort of ossified, and the West Coast is dynamic. The West Coast has to take over. And so I think that's actually happening in practice. Of course, Sriram was an A16Z guy for a while. Yeah, he's a good guy. I trust Sriram to do the right thing, in as much as his power. So Jim O'Neill, another example. So, and so I'm encouraged by that, because I think that the Wall Street people all are just insanely, they want a strong dollar and they want the ability to invest in China. The Silicon Valley people, Elon wants to invest in China, obviously. But then I think that most Silicon Valley people don't really care about China that much because China cut them off. China said, oh, you can't build your tech products here. So they don't like China as much. So, and you know, I think we need to become less dependent on China. And I think that a weaker dollar is part of the way we do that. And so the way the dollar collapse happens is internationalization of the yuan. The way the dollar collapse happens is that the yuan replaces it. China decides to financialize their economy. The problem is that's going to be, it's going to be tough on Chinese manufacturing, and that's why they're not doing it, because they want to manufacture, and they know that switching to an internationalized yuan will boost American manufacturing and hurt Chinese manufacturing by weakening the dollar and strengthening the yuan. So they don't want to do it, especially not so they won't do it while she's in power, but someone in the future may do it because it would raise living standards for Chinese people a lot by allowing them to afford a lot more imports. You know, China has a lot of natural resources. It's a big country geographically, but they don't have a lot of resources per capita because they got so many capitas out there, right? So basically, China would have to do what America did in the 20th century. That's sort of what you do when you're a successful hegemon ruling the world. But China hasn't won its hegemony yet, so they're not going to do this for a while. So we're going to try to force them to do that with tariff. Can we force them to do it with tariffs? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on how easily they can reroute production through third countries. And that's going to be the game.
Just to make sure we understand, what are the best ways or the best mechanisms by which we can weaken the dollar?
The best mechanism by us to weaken the dollar is for us to print dollars.
So having some inflation, basically.
That's right. That's right. If you really think that this will help Bitcoin, you should want this to happen. All the hard money people who are out there saying, no inflation, why, help, no, how dare you, blah, blah, blah. You know, like if they really thought that would help Bitcoin, why would they say that? Anyway, so yeah, so if you create more of something, it becomes less valuable. So print dollars, and then we need to buy yuan with that. So we need to basically do exactly what China does. We would have the central bank create dollars, which we can do, like we have the printing press. And it's not even a printing press, it's just a cell in Excel, right? You just press enter and it creates dollars. And so then create dollars, use them to buy Chinese yuan. That's how we weaken the dollar.
Is ideal inflation rate like 3% or something? Or what's the ideal inflation rate?
I don't know. The problem is that people really don't like inflation. And making imports more expensive through tariffs or through the currency intervention that I just described will certainly increase inflation. And people don't like that. And people might get mad, but maybe they won't, because maybe concerns about inflation during the Biden administration were a stand-in. Maybe people really didn't hate inflation that much. Maybe people just thought, what can I complain about that's politically correct, instead of complaining about like wokeness and anti-white racial discrimination or anti-Hispanic racial discrimination or anti-Asian racial discrimination, or public safety, lack of public safety. We need a lot more criminals up. Instead of that, like I'll complain about inflation. And Rick Perlstein argues, the historian, he argues that in the 70s, when everyone was ostensibly very, very mad about the Carter inflation, some of it was displaced anger over cultural change, over like feminism and the sexual revolution and crime in cities and all these things. American history kind of repeats itself a bit. So maybe that could give Trump some political leeway to do policies that might be inflationary, as long as they, boosted American manufacturing or something.
Right. And so the pros of a bit more inflation or a weakened dollar are that we will have, a closer to equal trade balance, that we can sort of inflate away some of the debt, perhaps. I'm going to kind of just get a list of the pros and cons. The cons are that everyone feels a bit poorer, basically, or that, sort of consumer surplus is a bit down.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. You wrote about another way by which countries experience macroeconomic crises, and that way was a deflationary depression. Can you explain that type of crisis?
That's right. So the emerging market crisis is one of the standard two types of economic crises. The other type of crisis is a depression. So when the United States had a Great Depression in the 30s, we didn't have inflation. We had actual deflation. Prices fell. And that's a different kind of thing, right? This caused the currency to weaken, but that doesn't always happen. So in the Great Recession, in the from 2009 through 11 or whatever, we didn't. Our currency actually strengthened. So this is less related. A depression is less related to currency. What it is related to is domestic factors, aggregate demand. What happens in this situation is that for some reason people stop buying stuff. People and companies stop buying stuff. And then prices go down because there's less demand, right? That's the deflation part. And then when prices go down, it makes it harder to service your debt. So suppose you borrow $1,000, right? You have to pay back $1,000. But suppose that prices get cut in half and your salary gets cut in half. Well, on paper, in terms of being able to buy stuff, you aren't actually any poorer, but in terms of paying off that $1,000 of debt, you're a hell of a lot poorer. You're just double in debt what you were before, right? So there's some evidence that a big overhang of debt, having all this debt built up within your system, that will make people not consume. But then when people don't consume, that's called the balance sheet recession. When people don't consume, then and when wages go down, when people get fired, all this bad stuff that happens when you have low aggregate demand, that increases the burden of debt. Private sector debt. I'm not talking about government debt here, although it does increase that burden as well. But I'm talking about private sector debt. I'm talking about the money that you owe on your house. I'm talking about the money that you owe on your car, your credit card, right? People go into this retrenchment mode with gotta pay down my debts, gotta pay down my debts, so they don't buy anything. So then prices go down. So then their debts get worse. So they're like, oh God, gotta buy, so their debts get worse in real terms. So then this is called debt deflation. It's not a kind of deflation. What it really just means is the way that debt and deflation create a vicious cycle. I wish they hadn't called it that. I wish they would have called it the debt deflation cycle, the debt deflation spiral, where people trying to pay down their debt results in it becoming harder to pay down your debt, right? Via deflation. And so that's a hallmark of a deflationary depression. Usually these are caused by debt, a financial crisis, with the financial system borrowing too much money. When we talk about debt, how much debt a country has, there is actually two completely different things. One of which is the debt that the federal government has, the central government debt, national debt. And the second is private debt, which is debt that we owe to each other primarily. And those are two completely different things, and they behave completely differently. And when people say too much debt causes a crisis, too much government debt in an economy that's dependent on imports can cause a currency crisis. But too much private sector debt can cause this deflationary depression, and they're almost exactly opposite kinds of crises. So what you want to do in a currency crisis, you need to have the government stop borrowing money so that you reduce inflation, right? But then when you have a deflationary depression, you need to get the debt. The problem is private debt. You need to get the debt off of the balance sheets of households and banks and companies. So you need to have the government hoover up that debt. So you need to have the government run a big deficit, basically bail out the economy so that you get rid of this tangle of overhang of debt that's causing people to retrench and to not want to spend anything. And I think, that's basically, those are, so it's this very opposite reaction. If you have this inflationary currency crisis, you want to have your government do austerity. And if you have a deflationary depression, then you want to have your government run big deficits.
Right. And you're saying China is potentially experiencing something like this now, right?
That's right. China has falling prices, and China's doing something that doesn't really so China's having a macro crisis. China binged on real estate. Everybody borrowed a hell of a lot of money to invest in real estate because there was this eternal giant real estate boom in China that there was like a third of the economy almost. And then that's more than we ever did in our big real estate bust, right? So it was a huge amount of the economy. And then everyone loaded up on debt, local governments, local government financing vehicles, banks, construction companies, developers, households who bought all these bonds. Everybody just borrowed, all this private sector debt, right? Then at some point, all this debt, the returns on these were predicated on house prices continuing to rise. What happens when house price stops rising? All this debt goes bad. And then everyone just wants to retrench. They want to pay down the debt. And then because of that, China suddenly has a shortage of aggregate demand, and you started getting unemployment rising in China, which meant that people had even less money to pay down their debt, so they even retrenched more. You had wages going down in China because of a shortage of aggregate demand. It's not as severe as the Great Depression, but it looks structurally similar. So what did Xi Jinping do? He's like, well, let's just make more stuff, manufacture more. Let's switch. This is a very like Austrian economics sort of traditional idea. He was very anti-Keynesian. He's like, fuck stimulus. That's just for, like losers. Stimulus is for losers. We've got to just invest in manufacturing, make more cars, make more batteries, make more solar panels, make more everything, machinery and steel, and make more everything, industrially. Let's make all these ships. I don't know. And so let's make all this stuff. So then they just had the banks just loan to industrial companies. So now you have 1 million car companies making 1 million cars. What happens when you glut the market with physical products? Prices fall. So they decided to glut these markets. So instead, they're trying to export all their stuff overseas because prices are falling domestically. So they're like, fuck, we can't move this product because no one wants to buy all this stuff. And we're having to drop prices, vicious price war. Let's export it all. So they did. So China's running this huge trade surplus. Now countries are like, we don't want you to forcibly deindustrialize us, so we're just going to put up tariffs. So now they're going to do that. So they put up tariffs. Europe is doing it less because Europe is just like, the biggest wimps on God's green earth. But, Turkey's doing it, Brazil's doing it, and Indonesia's doing it, and the United States will do it under Trump unless China bribes him. So China's going to try to bribe him not to do tariffs or to like make a lot of noise about tariffs and then cancel the tariffs on China. They'll try to do that, and they'll probably try to leverage Elon to get Trump to lower tariffs on China. So we'll see if that succeeds. But certainly tariffs are like one of the biggest things that Trump has run on, and he did do some tariffs in his first term. So Biden even put up some tariffs. So we'll see whether tariffs do anything. But then even without, even beyond that, China, the world can't absorb all that, buy all that Chinese stuff. China's going to have to sell stuff to China, and prices are falling in China. And that's making all these debts much harder to service, right? Because falling prices mean that yuan is worth less. And so but you still have to pay back the same number of yuan from all the debts that you borrowed back in the real estate boom. And so it's exacerbating this overhang of debt. Xi Jinping doesn't get this because he's not a Keynesian. He thinks that an economy is just real output. Make more cars. That's what an economy is. He doesn't understand that like financial stuff really matters to an economy because financial stuff is motivation. It's how you motivate people to actually make stuff. Your economy is not an economy of slaves. You don't have a centrally planned economy. You have an economy where people make stuff because they expect a return. And yes, you can tell people to make a bunch of cars, but the problem is that like this makes people not want to buy cars because the prices go down. That's something that they haven't grasped yet. Although now they're like, we're pivoting to stimulus, but their measures are still half-assed. They think that if they really pull out the stimulus bazooka, they'll be fiscally irresponsible. They'll run up all this debt. They'll, then they'll become this weak country where the government just supports consumption and blah, blah, which is what they think the West has become, decadent and weak. And we can't become that. We have got to become real manly men who make more cars. And then, so that's how they think. They're these boomers, right? They grew up.
And so those are the cons of being sort of stimulus oriented, but the reasons to be more stimulus oriented are for more economic growth, or why is that?
Well, I don't even know that those are the cons of being more stimulus oriented. I think that those are things that sometimes happen, but I don't know how much those depend on stimulus, right? So I think that these guys did, sort of mental conceptions of what makes a country great, what makes a country strong, and what makes a country rich are vague. They are based on their intuition from when they were a developing country. And when all you had to do was like build more things and more things happen, good things happen, grow out of every problem, grow out of all your debts, grow out of all your, grow out of recessions, just grow out of everything because everything's so underutilized, you can just build more stuff. That's all they've ever known growing up, and they think that'll still work. They just have to, we just got to build a different kind of stuff. And honestly, I think this is probably what the Austrian economists were thinking back in the Depression. And they were wrong, and the Keynesians are right. Keynes was right. I'm sorry, guys, but like, that's real. Keynes is right.
Right about which part exactly?
Keynes was right that aggregate demand can paralyze your economy even when your real economy is doing fine. Even when your real productive power exists, you can make people not want to utilize that capacity, and you can make people not want to buy things by screwing up your financial economy, and then you need to fix your financial economy with the government. That's what Keynes is right about. That's what stimulus really means, ultimately.
Got it. And so maybe you could just codify, and maybe we'll wrap part one this way, of just the pros and cons of stimulus, of being more stimulus oriented in terms of how a country should think about it.
Well, the con of being stimulus oriented is, first of all, political economic. You could get a situation where companies, rightly or wrongly, think that you have moral hazard where we can just screw around and we'll always just have the government there to bail us out. And then one day the government is no longer able to bail you out because you switch from a deflationary kind of crisis to an inflationary one. So the danger of stimulus is that you switch from the, country with too much stuff to the country with not enough stuff. The danger is that you flip to the other kind of crisis, basically. That doesn't happen overnight, but it could happen over time. So I think that's the danger. Then also another danger is that you have sort of political economic capture of the spending, where the people who get the money become entrenched interests who just, suck on the government teat forever. And then that makes your economy just less efficient, less productive, which makes you less rich in the long run. And this is what Tyler Cowen worries about when he worries about stimulus. So those are the drawbacks. The drawbacks of stimulus are, number one, macroeconomic, in that you could eventually, after a long period of this, you could flip to the inflationary kind of crisis instead of the deflationary kind. And then your currency can collapse, all this stuff. But that takes a long time for most countries. I would argue maybe Greece is there and only stopped from doing that by the euro. But I would say that it can happen. It could happen in the United States far down the line. But then I think Trump might move us in that direction. We'll see. But then I think the other danger is the microeconomic danger, the political economic danger that Tyler Cowen often talks about, which is that the way you do the stimulus spending creates a bunch of entrenched interests who just, are highly government dependent and capture the government basically and just then lower productivity. Those are the two dangers.
Yeah, cool. Well, let's wrap on that. This has been great.
All right. Until next time.
Econ 102 is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, In the Arena, The Cognitive Revolution, and more. If you like what you hear, subscribe and leave us a review in the App Store. You can keep up with both of our Substacks for written analysis of the topics we cover in the show at noahopinion.substack.com and eriktorenberg.substack.com. Thanks for listening.